the galaxy's most advanced species met humanity and immediately started building bigger guns. After first contact, the technologically superior alien civilization begins frantically upgrading their military because they recognize something in human warfare that transcends mere technology: the willingness to win at any cost. The moment Commander Zarathal witnessed the human fleet's tactical response to the Covenant's overwhelming technological superiority, she knew her species had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Not about human technology. They had correctly assessed that humanity's weapons were centuries behind their own. Not about human numbers. Earth's population was insignificant compared to the Covenant's trillion-strong civilization. The miscalculation was about something far more dangerous: the human capacity for absolute, uncompromising warfare when cornered. What followed would reshape galactic civilization forever, forcing the most advanced species in known space to confront a terrifying truth: that intelligence, technology, and numerical superiority meant nothing when facing an enemy that simply refused to lose. The first contact between humanity and the Covenant of Zephyria had been carefully orchestrated. For 3 years, the Covenant's deep space monitoring arrays had detected the primitive radio signals emanating from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The signals revealed a species that had barely achieved spaceflight, still confined to their home system, still fighting among themselves with chemical explosives and kinetic weapons. Admiral Kethmore, the Covenant's most decorated military strategist, had personally overseen the contact protocols. His species had made first contact with 47 different civilizations over the past millennium, and the pattern was always the same: initial fear, followed by awe at Covenant technology, followed by peaceful integration into their galactic commonwealth. The humans would see their plasma cannons that could vaporize entire mountain ranges, their shield generators that could deflect the energy of a star, their vessels that could fold space-time itself, and they would understand their place in the cosmic order. The Covenant prided itself on being benevolent conquerors. They offered protection, advanced technology, and membership in the most sophisticated civilization the galaxy had ever seen. In exchange, new species contributed their unique biological and cultural perspectives to the collective knowledge of the Covenant. It was a fair trade that had brought peace and prosperity to thousands of worlds. The meeting point was established in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, neutral territory that wouldn't make the humans feel threatened. 3 massive Covenant dreadnoughts, each the size of a small city, materialized from hyperspace with a display of technological prowess that had never failed to impress. Their hulls gleamed with crystalline armor that could withstand the heat of a stellar core, their weapon arrays crackling with barely contained energy that could sterilize entire planets. The human delegation arrived in what could only be described as a floating scrapyard: 3 vessels that appeared to be cobbled together from spare parts and held together with determination and prayer. Their hulls were scarred metal, their weapons crude projectile launchers, their life support systems so primitive they required constant maintenance. Admiral Kethmore felt a mixture of pity and admiration for any species that could reach space with such limited resources. Ambassador Sarah Chen led the human delegation, flanked by General Marcus Rodriguez and Dr. Elena Vasquez. As they materialized in the Covenant's pristine conference chamber via transportation beam, Kethmore noted their crude environmental suits and the way they marveled at the holographic displays and crystalline architecture surrounding them. "Welcome to the Covenant of Zephyria," Kethmore began, his words automatically translated by their universal communication matrix. "I am Admiral Kethmore, speaking on behalf of the Council of Worlds. We extend our greetings to the human race and offer you membership in our galactic civilization." Ambassador Chen stepped forward, her movements careful and measured. "Thank you for this opportunity, I'm Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing the United Earth Government. were honored by your offer and eager to learn about your civilization. The negotiations proceeded exactly as Kethmore had expected. The humans were clearly overwhelmed by the scale of Covenant technology and the scope of their interstellar empire. They asked detailed questions about defensive capabilities, trade agreements, and the rights of member species. All standard concerns that had been addressed in 47 previous first contacts. Dr. Vasquez seemed particularly fascinated by their quantum computing systems and gravitational manipulation technology. The theoretical implications alone could advance our understanding of physics by centuries, she whispered to Chen during a break in discussions. General Rodriguez, however, seemed more interested in their military capabilities. Your ships are impressive, Admiral. I assume they're primarily for exploration and defense. Defense and peacekeeping, Kethmore confirmed. The Covenant has faced very few military challenges over the past several centuries. Our technological superiority ensures that conflicts are resolved quickly and with minimal casualties. And if a member species decided to leave the Covenant? Kethmore's expression remained neutral, though he found the question curious. Such a situation has never arisen, General. The benefits of membership far outweigh any perceived disadvantages. Why would any rational species choose to return to isolation and technological stagnation? Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, but didn't pursue the matter further. The negotiations continued for several days, with the humans requesting time to consult with their government before making a final decision. This, too, was standard protocol, though Kethmore expected their answer would be the same as every other species had given. He was wrong. The response came 3 weeks later, delivered by the same delegation aboard the same ramshackle vessels. Ambassador Chen's expression was apologetic but firm as she addressed the assembled Covenant leadership. We're deeply grateful for your offer, Admiral, but we must respectfully decline membership in the Covenant at this time. Humanity values its independence and autonomy above all else. We're willing to establish trade relationships and cultural exchanges, but we cannot accept integration into your governmental structure. The silence in the conference chamber was absolute. In 1,000 years of galactic diplomacy, no species had ever refused Covenant membership. The benefits were too obvious, the alternatives too stark. Kethmore felt a genuine concern for these humans who were apparently choosing technological stagnation and isolation over enlightenment and protection. Ambassador Chen, he said carefully, I fear you may not fully understand the implications of your decision. The galaxy is not a safe place for isolated species. There are hostile forces, cosmic phenomena, and other dangers that only the Covenant's protection can shield you from. Your technology, while admirable given your limited resources, is simply inadequate for the challenges you will face. We understand the risks, Admiral, but we believe in our ability to face those challenges on our own terms. If circumstances change, we hope the Covenant will still be willing to reconsider our membership. Commander Zarathal, who had been observing the proceedings with growing fascination, spoke for the first time. What if we were to offer you a trial membership, a probationary period where you could experience the benefits of our technology while maintaining some degree of autonomy? General Rodriguez shook his head. We appreciate the offer, Commander, but our answer remains the same. Humanity must chart its own course. The human delegation departed with handshakes and promises to maintain communication. Admiral Kethmore watched their primitive vessels disappear into hyperspace and felt a profound sadness for a species that had chosen such a difficult path. He made a note in his files to monitor their progress and be ready to offer assistance when their inevitable request for help arrived. It never came. Instead, what arrived 18 months later was something that would haunt the Covenant leadership for years to come. A distress signal from the hegemony of Krax, one of their most recent additions to the galactic community. The message was brief and terrifying. Under attack by unknown human forces, defensive positions overrun, requesting immediate assistance. The Krax had been integrated into the Covenant just 5 years earlier, a militaristic species that had initially resisted membership through 3 separate conflicts. Their homeworld was heavily fortified, their fleet substantial, and their warriors renowned for their ferocity in battle. that they were requesting assistance against the primitive humans seemed impossible. Admiral Kethmore led a response fleet to the crack system, expecting to find evidence of some massive misunderstanding. Perhaps the humans had stumbled into Crack's territory and triggered an automated defense response. Perhaps rogue elements from both species had initiated an unauthorized conflict. What he found instead was a masterpiece of tactical brutality that would force him to completely reevaluate everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Crack's home fleet was in ruins. 73 vessels, each armed with weapons that could crack open small moons, had been systematically dismantled by a human force that should have been vaporized the moment they emerged from hyperspace. The debris field told a story that defied military logic. Commander Zarathal, serving as Kethmore's tactical analyst, studied the wreckage with growing amazement. "Admiral, these attack patterns don't make sense. The humans should have been destroyed before they could even target the Crack's vessels." "Show me," Kethmore ordered, his voice tight with concern. The holographic display materialized between them, showing the tactical reconstruction based on debris analysis and survivor testimony. The human fleet jumped in here, approximately 2 light minutes from the Crack's defensive perimeter. Standard protocol would be to hail them, issue warnings, and then engage if they continued to advance. And the Cracks followed standard protocol? Exactly. They sent communication requests, which the humans ignored. They fired warning shots, which the humans flew directly through. They began charging their main weapons, which should have been the end of the engagement. The display showed the moment of contact, human vessels that looked like floating scrapyards racing toward the gleaming Crack's battleships. The Cracks opened fire with their plasma cannons, direct hits on multiple human vessels. The humans should have been vaporized. Instead, the humans kept coming. Their ships absorbed damage that should have been fatal, their crews somehow surviving in vessels that were falling apart around them. But more disturbing was what they did next. They didn't return fire with their main weapons, Zarathal continued. Instead, they launched thousands of these small projectiles. Kinetic impactors, crude chemical explosives, even physical debris from their own damaged hulls. The Crack's point defense systems were designed to stop sophisticated energy weapons and guided missiles, not clouds of random metal fragments. The tactical display showed the human strategy unfolding with terrifying clarity. While the Cracks concentrated their fire on the main human vessels, smaller human craft, fighters, shuttles, even escape pods, swarmed through the debris field and began attaching explosive charges directly to Crack's hulls. The sophisticated shields that could deflect energy weapons were useless against physical contact. They turned their own destroyed vessels into weapons, Zarathal observed, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and admiration. When their ships were crippled, they rammed them into Crack's vessels. When their weapons were destroyed, they used the debris as projectiles. When their life support failed, they put on environmental suits and continued fighting in the vacuum. The final phase of the battle was the most disturbing. Human boarding parties, using nothing more sophisticated than shaped charges and personal weapons, had fought their way into the hearts of Crack's vessels designed to be impregnable. They moved through corridors filled with toxic atmosphere, under gravitational fields that should have crushed them, through defensive systems that should have stopped any organic intrusion. How did they survive the internal defenses? Kethmore asked, though he dreaded the answer. They didn't, Zarathal replied quietly. Human boarding party casualty rates exceeded 90%. They knew they were going to die, Admiral. They went anyway. The implications were staggering. The Cracks had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Every tactical doctrine in Covenant military history was based on the assumption that rational beings would surrender when faced with impossible odds. The humans had proven that assumption catastrophically wrong. Admiral Kethmore ordered an immediate withdrawal from the crack system and called for an emergency session of the Covenant Military Council. The debate that followed would last for 3 days and fundamentally reshape their understanding of galactic warfare. "We're dealing with a species that fights like they're already dead," General Vextar observed, his 4 arms gesturing emphatically at the tactical displays. "Every military engagement is based on the principle that both sides want to survive. Remove that principle, and every tactical advantage becomes meaningless." "But surely they can't sustain losses like this," Admiral Mordeth countered. "No species can maintain a military force with 90% casualty rates." Commander Zarathal, who had been quietly studying human cultural data, looked up from her research terminal. "That's where you're wrong, Admiral. Human military history is filled with examples of exactly this kind of warfare. They call it total war or existential conflict. When humans believe their survival as a species is at stake, they're willing to sacrifice everything." She activated a holographic display showing data from Earth's databases. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942. The Siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944. The Defense of Malta, 1940 to 1942. In each case, human forces sustained casualties that would have broken any rational military organization, and in each case, they won. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Covenant had built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that warfare was a rational activity conducted by rational beings who would make rational decisions about acceptable losses. They had never encountered a species that viewed warfare as an existential absolute, where victory was the only acceptable outcome. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" Admiral Kethmore asked. "I'm suggesting that we've been thinking about this wrong from the beginning. We approached the humans as if they were just another species to be integrated into our civilization, but they're not. They're a species that has evolved in a state of constant warfare, where survival required the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory." Zarathul brought up another display, this one showing human evolutionary history. "Look at their biological development. They're persistence hunters, evolved to chase prey until it collapses from exhaustion. They're social pack animals, evolved to coordinate group attacks against larger predators. They're tool users, evolved to overcome physical limitations through technology and strategy. And most importantly," she continued, "they're the only species in their ecosystem that survived to achieve spaceflight. Their planet had dozens of other intelligent species. The humans outlasted them all through a combination of technological innovation and absolute ruthlessness in warfare." The implications were terrifying. The Covenant had encountered a species that had literally fought its way to the top of an evolutionary ladder covered in the bones of its competitors. Every other species they had met had achieved spaceflight through cooperation and peaceful technological development. The humans had achieved it through warfare and conquest. "So what do we do?" General Vextar asked. Admiral Kethmore was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical displays that showed the systematic destruction of the Crack's fleet. "We prepare for war." The mobilization that followed was unlike anything in Covenant history. For the first time in centuries, their vast industrial capacity was turned toward military production. Shipyards that had been building exploration vessels and civilian transports were retooled to produce warships. Research facilities that had been focused on peaceful applications of technology were redirected toward weapons development. But the real change was in doctrine. Commander Zarathul was promoted to head of strategic planning and tasked with developing new tactical frameworks based on human military principles. The results were disturbing. We've been fighting civilized wars, wars where both sides follow rules, where civilian populations are protected, where surrender is an acceptable option. The humans don't fight civilized wars. They fight wars of extinction. The new doctrine was called Total Defense Protocol, and it required a fundamental shift in Covenant military thinking. Instead of minimal force and precision strikes, they would prepare for maximum force and overwhelming superiority. Instead of targeting military assets, they would be prepared to target entire planetary populations. Instead of accepting surrender, they would be prepared to fight until every human was dead. The weapons development that followed pushed Covenant technology to its absolute limits. Plasma cannons that could vaporize entire continents, gravitational weapons that could collapse star systems, bioweapons that could sterilize entire worlds. For the first time in their history, the Covenant was preparing to commit genocide. Dr. Thainpole, the Covenant's chief scientist, worked with a team of researchers to develop countermeasures for human tactics. He said, "Their primary advantage is their willingness to use their own destruction as a weapon. So we must develop weapons that can destroy them so completely that they cannot turn their own deaths against us." The research led to the development of quantum disintegration weapons that could erase matter at the subatomic level, leaving no debris to be weaponized. Temporal displacement weapons that could remove human forces from the timeline entirely. Reality distortion weapons that could make human vessels simply cease to exist. But even as they developed these ultimate weapons, the Covenant leadership felt a profound unease. They were preparing to become the very thing they had always opposed, a species that waged war without mercy or restraint. "We're changing," Commander Zarathul observed during one of their planning sessions. "The humans are forcing us to become something we never wanted to be." "Better that than extinction," Admiral Kethmore replied, though his voice carried no conviction. The first test of their new doctrine came when human forces attacked the Covenant colony world of Zirion Prime. The planet was home to 12 million civilians and defended by a modest garrison that should have been sufficient to repel any conventional attack. The humans arrived with a fleet that was outnumbered 10 to 1 and immediately began their assault. The Covenant forces, following the new Total Defense Protocol, responded with overwhelming force. Instead of the measured escalation that had characterized their previous military actions, they unleashed their full arsenal from the moment of contact. Plasma cannons that could have destroyed entire cities were used to target individual human vessels. Weapons that could crack open planets were used to eliminate single fighters. The human response was exactly what Commander Zarathul had predicted. They absorbed the devastating attacks and kept coming, turning their own destruction into weapons of retaliation. When their ships were crippled, they rammed them into Covenant vessels. When their weapons were destroyed, they used the debris as projectiles. When their life support failed, they continued fighting in the vacuum of space. But this time, the Covenant was ready. Their new quantum disintegration weapons erased human vessels so completely that no debris remained. Their temporal displacement weapons removed entire human formations from the timeline. Their reality distortion weapons made human attacks simply cease to exist. The battle lasted 14 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the human fleet. Not a single human vessel survived, and more importantly, no human weapons or debris remained to be salvaged or studied. For the first time since making contact with humanity, the Covenant had achieved a clean victory. Admiral Kethmore should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt sick. The weapons they had used to defeat the humans were capable of destroying entire civilizations. In developing countermeasures for human tactics, they had created the tools of galactic genocide. "We won," Commander Zarathul reported, though her voice carried no celebration. "Total casualties? 0 Covenant, 100% human. No enemy survivors, no salvageable materials, no intelligence gathered." And the cost? Kethmore asked. We used weapons that could have sterilized a dozen worlds. We deployed technology that violates every treaty we've ever signed. We became the kind of species we once fought against. The victory at Zarian Prime should have ended the human threat. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict. The humans had learned from their defeat just as the Covenant had learned from theirs. Their next attacks came not from space, but from within. Human infiltrators, using primitive but effective disguises, had penetrated Covenant society during the months of peaceful contact. They had studied Covenant technology, mapped their infrastructure, and identified their vulnerabilities. Now they struck from within, using the Covenant's own systems against them. The attacks were surgical and devastating. Power stations that supplied entire star systems were sabotaged with crude but effective explosives. Computer networks that controlled planetary defense systems were infected with simple but persistent viruses. Transportation hubs that linked the far-flung reaches of the Covenant were destroyed by human operatives who had somehow learned to operate advanced alien technology. They're not trying to defeat us in open battle anymore, Commander Zarathil observed, as reports flooded in from across Covenant space. They're trying to make us defeat ourselves. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical damage. The Covenant had always prided itself on the security and stability of their civilization. Citizens could travel freely between worlds, confident in the protection of their government. Now, every transport could be carrying human infiltrators, every power grid could be compromised, every computer network could be infected. Paranoia spread through Covenant society like a virus. Citizens reported their neighbors for suspicious behavior. Travel between worlds was restricted and monitored. Civil liberties that had existed for centuries were suspended in the name of security. The humans were succeeding in their goal of making the Covenant defeat themselves. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human scientist who had been part of the original contact delegation, had been particularly effective in her infiltration. Using her legitimate access to Covenant research facilities, she had spent months studying their technology and identifying weaknesses. Her sabotage of the primary computer network on Centauri Station had crippled communications across 3 star systems. When she was finally captured, Admiral Kethmore insisted on interrogating her personally. He found her in a detention cell that was more comfortable than most human living quarters, but her eyes burned with the same implacable determination he had seen in every human combatant. Dr. Vasquez, you are our guest. We showed you our technology, our culture, our way of life. We offered you membership in our civilization. Why did you betray that trust? She looked at him with something that might have been pity. Because you never understood what you were really offering, Admiral. You weren't offering us membership, you were offering us surrender. The Covenant provides protection, advancement, prosperity. The Covenant provides assimilation. You've absorbed 47 species into your civilization. How many of them still maintain their original cultures? How many still govern themselves? How many could survive if they chose to leave? Kethmore was silent because he knew the answer. In 1,000 years of benevolent rule, the Covenant had created a galaxy where no species could exist independently. They had made themselves indispensable. We know what happens to species that join the Covenant, Dr. Vasquez continued. Within a generation, they forget how to maintain their own technology. Within 2 generations, they forget how to govern themselves. Within 3 generations, they cease to exist as a distinct species. That's not true, Kethmore protested. The Zephyrians still maintain their cultural identity. The Morvani still practice their traditional arts. As museum pieces, Vasquez replied, as quaint entertainment for tourists. But they don't govern themselves. They don't make their own choices. They don't chart their own destiny. They exist at the pleasure of the Covenant Council. The interrogation continued for hours, but Kethmore found himself increasingly disturbed by the humans' arguments. The Covenant had always viewed their expansion as a benevolent, civilizing mission. They brought peace, prosperity, and advancement to primitive species. But humans saw it as cultural extinction. "So, you prefer war to peace?" he asked finally. "You prefer suffering to prosperity?" "We prefer freedom to security," she replied. "We prefer to fail on our own terms than to succeed on yours." That night, Admiral Kethmore stood on the observation deck of his flagship, staring out at the stars that represented the vast expanse of Covenant space. For the first time in his long career, he found himself questioning the fundamental assumptions that had guided his entire civilization. The Covenant had brought peace to the galaxy by making war impossible. They had eliminated suffering by making independence impossible. They had created prosperity by making choice impossible. And now they faced a species that valued choice more than prosperity, independence more than security, and freedom more than peace. Commander Zarathil joined him at the viewport, her expression thoughtful. "The interrogation didn't go well?" "It went exactly as I expected, and that's the problem." "Sir?" "They're not going to surrender, Commander. Ever. No matter what we do to them, no matter how many of them we kill, no matter how hopeless their situation becomes, they're going to keep fighting until every last human is dead. Then we'll have to kill every last human." The words hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Both officers understood the implications. The Covenant had never committed genocide. They had never even considered it. But the humans were forcing them to become something they had never wanted to be. "There might be another way," Zarathil said quietly. "What do you mean?" "What if we gave them what they want? What if we recognized human independence and left them alone?" Kethmore shook his head. "Impossible. The precedent would be catastrophic. If one species can successfully reject Covenant membership, others will follow. Our entire civilization would collapse." Would it? Or would it just change? The question haunted Admiral Kethmore for days. The Covenant had been built on the assumption that their way was the only way, that their civilization was the apex of galactic development. But the humans had proven that there were other ways to organize society, other values to pursue, other paths to follow. The final confrontation came when human forces launched a desperate attack on the Covenant capital world of Zephyr Prime. It was clearly a suicide mission, a last-ditch effort to strike at the heart of the enemy, even knowing it would fail. The human fleet was outnumbered 1,000 to 1, outgunned by weapons that could destroy stars, and facing defenses that had never been breached in recorded history. They came anyway. Admiral Kethmore commanded the defense personally, deploying every weapon in the Covenant arsenal. The battle was less a fight than a massacre. Human vessels vaporized by weapons that could crack open moons. But still they came, wave after wave of ramshackle ships filled with humans who knew they were going to die. The breakthrough came when a single human fighter, its hull melted by plasma fire and its pilot surely dead, somehow managed to penetrate the planetary defense grid. It crashed into the central command complex, its crude nuclear warhead detonating in a flash of primitive atomic fire that barely scratched the building's crystalline structure. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The humans had touched the untouchable, breached the impregnable, struck at the very heart of Covenant power with nothing more than determination and the willingness to die. Standing in the ruins of his command center, surrounded by debris that would take days to clean up, Admiral Kethmore finally understood what they were fighting. The humans weren't just another species to be integrated or eliminated. They were the embodiment of a principle that the Covenant had forgotten, that some things were worth dying for. The ceasefire came 3 days later, announced simultaneously by both sides. The terms were simple. The Covenant would recognize human independence and territorial sovereignty, while humanity would agree to limit their expansion to systems not claimed by other species. Trade and cultural exchange would continue, but there would be no further pressure for integration.
The announcement sent shockwaves through Covenant society. For the first time in their history, they had been forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of a way of life that rejected their own. Other species began to question their own membership in the Covenant, wondering if they too might choose independence over security. But the changes went deeper than politics. The war with humanity had forced the Covenant to confront fundamental questions about the nature of civilization, freedom, and the right of species to determine their own destiny. They had been forced to develop weapons capable of destroying entire civilizations, and in doing so, they had discovered that they were capable of becoming monsters. Commander Zarathil, now promoted to Admiral, stood before the Covenant Council to deliver her final report on the human conflict. "We set out to integrate another species into our civilization," she began. "Instead, we discovered that our civilization was capable of genocide. We thought we were the most advanced species in the galaxy. Instead, we learned that advancement without wisdom is just sophisticated barbarism." The council listened in uncomfortable silence as she continued. "The humans taught us that there are things worth dying for, but more importantly, they taught us that there are things not worth killing for. Our way of life, our system of government, our vision of galactic civilization, these are not worth the price of extinction." The aftermath of the war saw unprecedented changes in Covenant society. The weapons of mass destruction developed for the human conflict were dismantled and their technology banned. The forced integration policies that had shaped galactic civilization for centuries were abandoned. For the first time in their history, member species were given the option to leave the Covenant and pursue independent development. To everyone's surprise, most chose to stay. But the knowledge that they could leave, that they had a choice, transformed the relationship between the Covenant and its members. What had once been a benevolent dictatorship became a true confederation of free species. The humans, meanwhile, began their own expansion into the galaxy, but they did so as humans, maintaining their independence, their culture, and their willingness to fight for what they believed in. They established colonies, formed alliances, and gradually built their own interstellar civilization based on principles of freedom and self-determination. Years later, Admiral Kethmore found himself serving as the Covenant's ambassador to the Human Colonial Federation. The irony was not lost on him. The species that had once threatened to destroy galactic civilization had become its greatest teacher. He was meeting with President Sarah Chen, the former ambassador who had first refused Covenant membership. She was older now, her hair silver with age, but her eyes still held the same determination that had characterized humanity's response to Covenant expansion. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her. "The war, the casualties, the suffering you could have avoided by accepting our original offer?" She considered the question carefully. "I regret every life lost, Admiral, every human and every Covenant citizen who died in that conflict. But I don't regret the principle we fought for. Freedom is worth fighting for, even when the cost is terrible." "And if you had to make the choice again?" "I'd make the same choice," she replied without hesitation, "because the alternative wasn't really living. It was just existing. Admiral Kethmore nodded, understanding finally what had driven the humans to such desperate measures. They had been offered everything except the one thing they valued most, the right to choose their own path, even if it led to destruction. The galaxy was a different place now. The Covenant still existed, still offered advanced technology and protection to member species, but they no longer demanded cultural assimilation or political integration. Species were free to join, free to leave, free to chart their own course through the stars. And at the heart of this transformation was a simple truth that the humans had taught them, that the willingness to die for freedom is what makes life worth living. The most advanced species in the galaxy had learned from the newest that sophistication without wisdom is just elaborate barbarism, and that true civilization is measured not by the power to destroy, but by the wisdom to choose not to. The war that had begun with humanity's refusal to surrender had ended with the galaxy's most powerful civilization learning to surrender its need for control. In fighting for their independence, the humans had freed not just themselves, but every species in the galaxy. They had proven that there were limits to what technology could achieve, and that the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with principles. As Admiral Kethmore prepared to leave the human embassy, President Chen offered him a final thought. "You know, Admiral, you were right about one thing. The galaxy is a dangerous place for isolated species, but it's an even more dangerous place for species that have forgotten how to be alone." The truth of those words would echo through the ages, a reminder that the greatest threat to any civilization is not external conquest, but the loss of the very qualities that make survival worthwhile. The humans had reminded the galaxy that strength comes not from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the willingness to die for one's principles. And in the end, that willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom had saved not just humanity, but the very soul of galactic civilization itself.